Good morning. This is Ben Evans. I'm here today with Courtney Cudlip. Is a little bit of a background to Courtney. She has been with Crestone Peak Resources for over 3 years. She's a manager within their sourcing department. And she has, over the last couple of years, worked with Auditech to implement a supplier review program at Crestone to look at the contractual relationships that exist between Crestone and some of its suppliers. So with that, I'll turn the time over to Courtney to give a little bit more of an introduction into her background, both at Crestone and prior to Crestone. So again, Courtney, thank you so much for meeting with us today. And please give us some of that background.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and talk about my experiences. For those of you that don't know Crestone, we are a recently formed E&P oil and gas company. The company started in July of 2016 when they acquired the assets from Encana Oil and Gas. And I joined as a contractor 4 years ago in September of 2016. I was brought on as a contractor to really stand up their supply chain organization, define and implement new policies and procedures, as well as support the vendor onboarding and getting their capital program up and running. With that, I decided I really liked the company and where we were going, so I converted over to an employee. And since then have grown our team to have 2 analysts in the supply chain organization, as well as taking over the payables group, which has 2 individuals as well. Prior to joining Crestone, I was a consultant with IBM. So on the vendor side, the flip side, supporting their overall program management for large transformation projects, as well as supporting contracting efforts in managing the P&L for each of the contracts at IBM.
Great. So just to summarize, your current team at Crestone, you've got quite a number of responsibilities there. So making sure that the processes on the vendor side are operating correctly, payables. What were some of the other items that I guess, just to summarize the items that your team covers?
Yeah, so we're a true source to settle organization, which I think is a great integrated approach. So my team oversees 4 primary disciplines. The primary driver is vendor onboarding and compliance. So making sure that we set the tone from vendor first transaction, as well as making sure that they're compliant with all of our EHS, e-invoicing, and ACH payment requirements. We do procurement as well, so run sourcing events, support our business partners with any sort of procurement related materials or services. The third domain is our inventory management. So we support all of the accounting and purchasing for any sort of inventory or critical spares. And the fourth domain is our accounts payable or our settlement process. So working through how do we actually pay our vendors through the transaction. So it's a unique position to see the full life cycle from your first transaction when you're sending a contract or the initial onboarding information to your vendor, all the way to settlement when you're actually paying them.
Yeah, I do think, and the reason I kind of asked that question twice is having worked with you for a number of years, you really do touch a huge swath of the organization from the procure to pay process for a company the size of Crestone. So, which I think does create a lot of synergy that wouldn't normally exist in your sourcing position. So, okay. Well, I guess kind of jumping into the reason we're having a discussion with you today is to talk about, one initiative and project that you have been focused on the last couple of years, which is doing these vendor audits. And I think it's been just over 2 years since you started doing that. You were the original, person who was in charge of that process. What were the main drivers? Why did, at the beginning, and we're going to kind of grow into what it grew into, but at the beginning, what were the main reasons that you thought, we're going to start a program looking to audit our suppliers?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, when we started, we formed as a company in July of 2016. And within 3 months, we stood up a very large capital program. And so how I describe it is it was organized chaos. Everyone was in the trenches together. We were working on standing up a drilling and completions program while also standing up this company. And so a lot of the processes were loosely defined at the beginning in 2016 and 2017. And the big push in 2017 really was to define and modify a lot of our processes. Because of that, our contracts at the very beginning, a lot of them were handshake deals, price list based, or they may have had a formal service order and subsequent change orders. And so when we first started it, how I posed it to our management is, A, there may be a recovery component to it, but B, it's really an audit on supply chain and how can we improve how we're contracting and engaging with our suppliers and making sure that we're compliant with the price list that they're submitting and making sure we don't have any sort of price variance between how we award the bid and what we're actually getting invoiced. And so I think for us, it was just really a reflection on, hey, what was our grade when we first started up and how well did we do in making sure that our vendors were compliant with what they submitted. So that was kind of the primary driver. I think because we were a new company, the secondary motive is we wanted very early on for our vendors to know that they are going to be reviewed and that we are going to hold them accountable for the pricing that they submit. And so I think there was an accountability component that we were fortunate that we were able to implement pretty early on so that our vendors kind of knew, right out of the gate, hey, we're not going to be able to deviate from our price list without supply chain getting involved, which sometimes I think that's where you see a little bit of scope creep is when the vendors don't necessarily think someone is going to be looking or reviewing their pricing.
Great. And I think you went into it with pretty open eyes on what your goals were. A lot of times when we're working with organizations, they might have one or two of those motives and kind of find the other benefits as they move along through the process. But just taking notes on what you just said, Crestone, as they started up, was looking to define processes. Some things when you're first starting up or just getting done and not necessarily, following the letter of the law, you wanted to focus on one, making sure that vendors knew they were going to be audited, two, defining that process. And then there might be some recoveries that could help cover the cost and bring some financial impact back to Crestone. Is that a fair summary of kind of what you were looking for when you signed up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then I guess the next question, and again, I'd say Crestone was in a position where you really had a good idea of the benefits you were going to get. But were there any things that kind of came out of it that were beneficial that you weren't really anticipating, or you weren't anticipating to the degree that they ended up occurring? Right? Are there any instances where you're like, hey, I thought I'd get this, but I also got that on the positive side? And we'll get to the negative side too. So,
yeah, I think the biggest, I would say, unanticipated benefit was we, on the operational side, saw a lot of benefit on how we were contracting across departments. And so one of the things that we look at, is we'll have a sourcing event for a particular department with a vendor. And then, subsequent departments may use that same vendor. But having consistency on how we're contracting and the pricing we're getting across our departments. So for example, on one of our audits, we had Department A that had a trip charge and it was a flat rate and it was well-defined. Department B decided to use that same vendor. There was a trip charge and it wasn't consistent, even though the services being rendered were the same for the two departments. And so I think for us, having a third party come in and holistically look at the relationship with our vendors versus a transaction-based approach that sometimes we take in supply chain was extremely beneficial. I think for our field ops guys, so that was kind of the benefit I got was, hey, how can we do a better job looking and managing our vendor relationships more holistically? On the field operations side, and we got incredible support from our field ops, which I think is somewhat rare because it is time consuming. I think they started to see some things in invoicing behaviors that really opened their eyes on how do we have our operations a little bit more efficiently, and also how do we look at tickets as they're coming in and catch those items, a little bit more proactively. So things like mileage charges, where are our vendors coming from? Are they consistent on their mileage? I think was one example where they're used to signing off on a mileage charge, but it may not be from the actual location they're coming from, or may not vary from our location to location. It just may be flat rate and not reflective of actual miles driven.
Great. Yeah, you brought up something that I did another interview like this last week, and I've never thought of this point, but they raised the exact same concept, which is that the term I'm using is cross-pollinate, right? You have different departments, and you were able to drive consistency across those departments, find things that are, working in one area and cross-pollinate to another area. That's an insight I've never really sold or thought of as a benefit, but I've had two people independently say, hey, one thing is when we're looking at this globally across our whole organization, we're able to take some best practices or some items that might be in one group and make sure that they're being implemented in all groups. So appreciate that insight. And then with your field ops people, you're helping to close the gap, right? I mean, essentially they are doing a better job of catching things before they become billing errors is what I'm hearing. And so, which again is something we do hope occurs with these types of programs, that when we identify errors and say, hey, there's an overcharge here, and maybe even seek financial recovery for those, if we put Crestone and a client in a position to be able to make sure that those errors don't occur in the future, or they occur with far less frequency, that's always the best case scenario for the organization.
Yeah, and I think it's opened up a lot of proactive conversation with our vendors. There's certain vendors that we only touch, call it once a year, where we sit down and we renegotiate a price list for that year. And things may change in the field, operations may change, they may get requests from people. And I think through the audit process, it really helped us open lines of communication regarding expectations. So, hey, if you're getting a request for additional services or price changes, make sure that we're in those conversations. And now our field people know that, but also our vendors know that. So it's not an after the fact. I think a lot of our vendors we're seeing feel more comfortable reaching out to supply chain, where it's not going to be a negative or a slap on the wrist or a bad thing. It's really kind of, how do we have more of a collaborative relationship on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't mean to toot your horn, but one approach that I think you've done a really good job with this program managing it is, as findings were coming out, you kind of didn't take a one size fits all approach with your vendors. And there were, multiple instances where there were findings in different situations, and based on what was happening in the business, based on what the relationship was with the supplier, what was, happening off contract, and those expectations, those were kind of taken into consideration as you figured out, how do we resolve these historical findings with my existing partners? And more importantly, how do we make sure this is a better program, a better relationship moving forward? I think that approach is one of the reasons you're getting that type of a reaction from the suppliers, where suppliers are now trying to get out in front of it. They understand the expectation is, hey, if there's a question on this contract, if there's a question on how things are supposed to operate, let's have a discussion. Don't just guess at it. And we Crestone, we'll try to do the same thing on our side. So, well, to be fair, I mean, there's also, going into this program, and I've had many clients share this, there's some challenges you probably didn't anticipate, at least to the degree that they occurred. What are some of the challenges as you kind of came into it as a doughy-eyed sourcing manager? We're going to do some supplier audits till the point where you're doing them. What are some challenges that came in that you weren't anticipating?
Yeah, I think there's three big challenges that most organizations will face. The first is the time constraint, right? Anytime you're taking on an additional project, you have competing demands. And so there was some time and effort involved, especially on some of the more contentious claims or vendors that we had. I think the second goes back to accountability. I think it was great that we introduced accountability into our vendor relationships and into our field ops, but at times there were difficult conversations where we had to talk to our business partners internally about handshake deals or changes or discussions that they may have had that didn't flow through the supply chain and the contracting process. And so I think those were some difficult, even internal conversations, not even with the vendors, where we have to say, like, we really need to know if you made a commitment to a vendor that we didn't capture in a contract, which we need to then honor. And I think the third is, there are some times where we have difficult conversations with vendors where they may have intentionally or unintentionally made errors in their billings, and you have to, have the conversation about why it occurred and have those recovery conversations. I feel very fortunate in that I think we have a great working relationship with our vendors, and I think the settlement process was overall much easier than I anticipated. With 80% of our vendors, but 20% of those audits did result in either having multiple conversations for request or having a lot of conversations for settlement. And you just have to be prepared to have difficult conversations, not only with your vendors, but also sometimes internally within your organization.
Great. Yeah. So the two, to summarize, time constraints, or maybe a little more than you were expecting, just to support the process of negotiation and settlement primarily, but also to make sure the right data was coming in, you were getting the support needed from the vendors to be able to perform the audit. And then difficult conversations, that there were instances in which there's findings and you have to kind of address something that is a sensitive topic, and you have to work through it. And around that time constraint, this kind of leads into another question I have. So around that time constraint topic, a sourcing, procurement department, there's a lot of initiatives that you can be performing. Probably a lot of initiatives you are, even within your organization. A lot of things you aren't, because you don't have an unlimited amount of time. If you were talking to another sourcing and procurement professional, what are some reasons why you would promote a supplier audit program as a initiative and an investment, as you just highlighted, right? A time investment over maybe some other options?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things is making sure that you do have that accountability within your supply chain organization. So I think we viewed it as a continuous improvement initiative, really. It's just as much of an audit on my department and how are we contracting and how are we setting expectations with our vendors as it is about the actual audit to the vendor. And so I think when you approach it that way, because everyone loves the word continuous improvement and wants to make sure their organization is always improving and keeping up with best practices and contracting standards. I think if you view it in that light, I think a vendor audit, if people are concerned about that vendor relationship, if you also take the onus and say, hey, this is just as much an audit on my organization and how we're doing as it is our vendors, I think that's a different spin versus more of a punitive, we're trying to just, hammer our vendors and get recoveries.
Right. Yeah. And that kind of leads into my next question. I think you've partially answered this, but I'll let you elaborate on it. Within your own organization, is you're trying to talk to other members of your organization to explain, hey, we're going to be doing some supplier audits. We're going to be looking into the supplier, asking them for information, working directly with them. Were there any concerns that were coming out of other members of your organization, and how did you address those? How did you make sure other people in the Crestone organization felt comfortable with the process of this moving forward, all the key stakeholders within your organization?
Yeah, before we actually communicated externally to our vendors, we had an internal huddle that we are taking on this program and kind of outlining the objectives as well as the time requirement that we would need from each of the departments. And it was supported by our CFO and our VP of operations, which was extremely helpful. And I think a lot of those guys were just as curious as, especially during that startup period, because they remember the painful nights and Fridays and weekends that we worked. They were just as curious to see, what were the findings and how well did we do during that startup period. And so we got a lot of buy-in. I think the difficult thing is everyone has great relationships in the field with their vendors, and they have, I call them sweetheart relationships at times, where those vendors can do no wrong. And so I think managing expectations that, hey, we most likely are going to find things, and that's okay. It's not a bad thing. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're always going to go after recoveries, but it's better to know kind of your downfalls or the issues that you have to correct them versus just, live in the dark.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that comment. We're probably going to find stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean this is a bad relationship. I use the analogy of marriage counseling a ton. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody has things that they can improve on. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not still, I guess the term used is a sweetheart vendor. It just means that we can always improve. We can always do a little bit better, continuous improvement, right? And I think that's the case, 99% of the time, when we have these findings, they're just errors that occur. They're judgment calls that are made by suppliers when there's ambiguity. They're miscommunications within a client organization or within a supplier organization or between a client and a supplier, and don't really have any, grounding in anything intentional or fraudulent, but just the kind of stuff that happens when complex business takes place. So I like that background. So I guess moving into a different subject, you used an outside firm. So Crestone used an outside firm to perform these audits. Why and what benefits did you find in using an outside firm as opposed to, conducting and looking into some of these items yourself? You and yourself.
Yeah, so we actually did our first contract compliance audit internally with a vendor that we knew we had overbillings. And so it was my 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. job to do the data analytics and tie out invoices and create the support. And it didn't end up well. We didn't end up getting the type of recovery that we were anticipating. And so I think that scenario and that vendor audit identified that we may not have the time or the skill set really to help with vendor audits and doing the analytics and getting the support and really, putting the documentation and the compelling story together. And I think B, from a vendor perspective, we didn't have enough credibility because it was just us as the customer. And so after that event, that's really what led us to looking at an external third party to kind of take those learnings from that initial vendor audit that we did internally and kind of scale it up. And so I think there's three big areas of why we decided to go with an external firm. The first is that dedicated attention. So this is the third party's job day in and day out. They have a staff to support it. They have resources. They have, working hours to actually do the work. The second is really the skill set. So I'm not a forensic accountant. I think there are not very many that are in-house for forensic accountants in small firms. And so I think having that, specific skill set in a third party is pretty unique and something that was very valuable. And then the third goes back to that credibility when we're talking to our vendors. Having an actual audit firm and a third party lended a lot of credibility into those conversations, where it's not a he said, she said, or an interpretation. It's kind of that third party external view of just the data set and the source contracts that really helps. And I think especially in our process or your process, where you take both the contracts that I give you as the customer, but also the contracts that are provided from the vendor and mash that up. So you're seeing both sides. It truly gives you a lot of credibility because it is more of an independent third party review versus kind of just me saying, hey, this is my interpretation of our contract. I disagree with how you build us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some benefit in me able to have an outside company take a position. Hey, this is the contract position. And then that puts Crestone in this case in a position to say, hey, we understand the contract position. There's also some business nuance to it. And here's how we want to approach resolution, which may not always be. And I think in the case working with Crestone, more often than not, isn't always just strict to the contract. There, like you alluded to earlier, there are things that were occurring outside of the contract, agreements that were, not necessarily memorialized that in some cases were taken into account as you determine how resolution should be handled. I guess down that same vein, if you're talking to another sourcing or procurement professional that's looking to use an outside firm for these services, what are some of the attributes that you would tell them to look for as they're going through that proposal RFP process with outside firms? And what are some things you'd tell them to kind of look out for to keep away from?
Yeah, I think the first is understanding their process for how do they actually scope an engagement, but then what are the mechanics within that engagement? So how are you going to take this, voluminous volume of transactions that you may have with a vendor and work through the audit process? What does that look like from the time with your vendor? What does that look like with the time with your business? What does that look like with the time from a supply chain? I think really understanding the mechanics of how the audit firms go about their work, because it may be different. And so Audit Tech, I love the approach where you guys will do an initial review stage to kind of identify if there is a potential for overbillings and what are the key kind of areas that we want to dive deeper into. And then you actually go into the audit work. So I think the actual process is really important to understand in an RFP and selection process. I think the second is just kind of the professionalism and the understanding of the business for any audit firm. What I've really appreciated is you guys handle most of the communication. I'm involved in the kickoff calls with the vendors and also when things get a little bit more contentious. But overall, I trust your professionalism and trust you to represent Crestone in a way that's consistent with how we treat our vendors, respectful, with integrity. And so I think having that professionalism is really important. And then I think the third item is just understanding what the settlement process looks like and understanding like what is kind of that claim to recovery ratio and how do you work through that. Again, one of the things that we've been really fortunate in our working relationship is we will really target the high value, easy slam dunks. And we may have to negotiate or concede on some of those areas where, we still feel we have a strong position, but the vendor feels they have a strong position in order to get recovery. And so I think having a very pragmatic approach when it comes to the recovery and settlement process is really important to know coming up front. If you have, the hammer that's going in and that aligns with your business strategy, that's great. And that firm may be a good fit for you. For us, we wanted to make sure we had really strong vendor relationships coming out of it. And so taking kind of a cost benefit approach on the recovery side was extremely important to us.
So to restate that, it sounds like making sure there's a cultural fit in how the work is going to be approached with your key strategic vendors and the delivery model. If there might be some instances in which, like you've said, if a firm's looking to which I think very few companies are looking to go in there and just crash heads and damage relationships, but if that is there are firms that would fit that. But in the situation where you're trying to preserve relationships, you want to make sure things are better moving forward, making sure that the approach and the system that's being taken by the audit firm is aligned with that's pretty critical, because you are putting individuals in touch with some of your key relationships in your key accounts.
Yeah, and it was helpful for us because so at Crestone, we engage Audit Tech not only for the contract compliance portion, but also for our AP review. So that includes looking at duplicate invoices and doing vendor statement reviews for any open credits that we haven't taken. And so I think for us, having one technology platform to manage that claims process was really helpful. And I think having one integrated firm so that our vendors, whether it's on duplicate invoices or statement reviews or on contract compliance, they know one firm name, I think really helps us just from a third-party vendor perspective that like, hey, we have a more of an integrated and holistic audit approach when it comes to our payables, not kind of a piecemeal where you may have 2 or 3 firms and they're looking at different pieces.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I think we're coming up against time here. So again, I do want to thank Courtney for taking time out of her extremely busy schedule to talk with us today. I guess the last kind of out question would be, if you're talking to, Courtney at a different company, someone in sourcing or in procurement that's considering implementing a supplier audit program, is there anything else or any, tips or pointers I haven't kind of covered in these questions or discussion that you would throw out there?
Yeah, I think the first thing, is do a little bit of soul searching to make sure that you have the time and have the backup to take on a contract compliance audit. I know our former AP supervisor, when I first said we were going to do this, she was like, do we even have contracts? Does that even exist? So make sure that you have contracts and you want to take it on, and that you're okay with feedback that, hey, there's probably areas that you need to improve those contracts. I think that's something that everyone needs to be receptive of. And I think the second is really defining those objectives up front of what are you hoping to gain out of that, because that'll help you when you're in, difficult conversations on the settlement side. You can tie it back to those objectives that'll help you through those conversations. And then I think third is look at a third party that you trust to represent you when it comes to your vendors. I know Auditech has done an incredible job for us, and we definitely would not have had such a successful program if it weren't for them. And so those would be my kind of tips for anyone in my shoes at another company.
All right. Great. Thanks so much, Courtney. And again, I want to respect your time. We're up against the end of our discussion, but again, can't thank you enough, and have a great day. Appreciate it.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, bye.